Everyone has tales about the strange and bizarre, but my story is how my half-whole mask saved my life, and it continues to save my life to this very day. Late in December, I was traveling from North California to my house in the state of Oregon. Nothing fancy, I was just going to visit the family for the holidays. On my way north, I hit a small snowstorm. Nothing awful, just a lot of snow falling at once. I wasn't worried about the small increase of snow at first, considering I had snow tires installed before I started my long journey home. I did, however, get a little hesitant to drive when the snow started to really come down. The large amount of falling snow, coupled with the large amount of already littering the ground as I traveled higher into the mountains, caused me to consider finding a place to stay for the night. I figured I could get some sleep while the storm passes over. That and the fact I could give my car's heater a break before it would decide to burst into flames, or worse, just stop working altogether. I scanned as much as I could over the landscape, but there were no buildings in the immediate area. The only other option I had for my predicament was to keep driving and hope there was a town or exit nearby that I could take in order to escape from the storm. Must have been driving for at least over an hour before I sighted a sign up ahead indicating how far the closest city was. My heart sank when I read that 162 miles. As it flew by my windshield and vanished into the snowy night. At this point, the snow was beating against my windshield, and I knew that I wasn't going to last 162 miles, let alone 62 miles. The digital clock on my radio read 1:21 a.m., and I decided that my next turn off I saw I would take and hope that I could find a neighborhood that was wholesome or would produce some result in my current endeavor. My thought process was either freeze to death in my car or stay the night at some random person's house. Weighing the two options in my head, I picked the only thing sane person would pick and go with the house. After another 30 minutes flew by, still no luck finding a place to pull off. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I saw it turn off in the distance, and a small shape start to make its way closer into my headlights. In no further inspection, it was revealed to me that there were two wooden poles, possibly belonging to a fence. When I turned into the road between the two wooden poles, the ground beneath me felt like rocky and rough, like I was traveling into gravel. I didn't drive for too long there before I started to see a small cabin creep into my field of view. The lights in the cabin were off, but the place seemed to be in pretty good shape. I parked my car under a tall, wild-looking tree that took the residents of the cabin's front lawn. Getting out of my car, I immediately grabbed my extra jacket, pulling it over the half-whole mask I wore around my neck, up over my ears to keep my head warm. I put my cap on, tugged up to the cabin after the escape of the windy night. What I felt like was my salvation immediately regretted not getting many gloves for my hands. Despite the irritation, I held them with my face and the rest of my body comfortably warm, so I didn't have much room to complain. I stuffed my frozen hands deep into my pockets and continued my journey across the cabin's lawn. As I made my way to the door, I noticed something odd. There was no indication of life anywhere. There wasn't even a car in the front yard. Taking my right hand out of my pocket, I knocked 3 times, waiting patiently before saying, "Hello, is anyone there? I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I really need a place to stay for a few hours." Nothing answered my plea for help, so I knocked 3 more times on the door, hitting my knuckles harder against the aged wood of the entrance. "Hello," I said again a little louder, before continuing with, I'm not here to rob you or anything. I just need a place to stay for the rest of the night. I promise I'll be gone by sunrise. As I finished my sentence, I touched the ornate metal door handle and noticed the door seemed to be unlocked. I said in a loud voice, I'm coming in now. If there's anyone in, please don't shoot me. I pressed the metal lever down, finding a bit of old that the door was unlocked. I opened the door with little resistance on the other end, closing behind me. Within about the same resistance, despite the fact finding the door locked and finding it really old. Looking around the area, I noticed the cabin had 5 rooms. The living room, which was the biggest room, a small, clean kitchen, an even smaller washroom, and what I'd assume were 2 small bedrooms in the back. No lights. On the inside of that cozy cabin, making it almost pitch black dark. If my eyes weren't already adjusted to the darkness from the outside, I decided the best thing to do was search for a light switch, so I took out my phone and turned on my flashlight app to scan the walls. My scan produced no results, however, and at the risk of losing my precious battery power on my phone, I decided the best option would be to turn off the light and put my phone on airplane mode. Before turning off my light, I studied the paintings hanging on the wall that I glossed over in initial scan. Each painting that crossed my sights was just a typical landscape or harbor, things like that. There was a painting that looked like a fox on a hunt or something like that, but other than that, it was just typical paintings you would see hanging on the walls around an elderly person's home. There was a painting, however, that caught my attention. The painting was very small, considered what looked like 2 adults, a mother, a father, and a teenage girl, and a small child. The family captured in that painting were wearing what looked like Victorian clothing. I'm only guessing about the clothes. I mean, it could have been from the 1800s or early 20th century. At that point, the clothing was very ornate and regal. There was something really disturbing about that image and painting, though. The faces of each member of the family looked like they were smoothed over with clay. It's kind of hard to describe, but 3 of the family members looked like they had no facial features, but no facial features instead of the normal facial features, I have. 3 people in the painting had grooves of smooth flesh, where normally they would have had eyes, nose, or a mouth. The only person in the painting that didn't possess a blank face was a teenage girl, which had a normal face features. The teenage girl, in fact, was quite breathtaking. I pulled myself away at the painting to take a glance at my phone at the time. My phone indicated that it was past 2 o'clock in the morning, so I decided to go back into a room and check if it was occupied. To my relief, the room was vacant. Besides medium-sized bed, ornate dresser, and nightstand, there wasn't too much to go by. The walls were blank beside more savvy paintings, give a little more than atmosphere. Although there was no indication of heating system beside the chimney in the rooms, there seemed to stay pretty warm. I was only going to be there for a few hours anyway, so there wasn't much point in just starting a fire. Plus, if people owned the cabin, wouldn't be back tonight considering how late it was. I hopped into the worn-out bed facing the open door next to another door I assumed was a closet, pulled out my half-whole mask, and completely covered up my face to make sure my head would stay nice and warm for the rest of the night. Pulling the fabric of my mask down slightly, I set an alarm with my phone for 4:30 a.m. Put it back down onto the nightstand. I covered my face again and bundled up tightly with the sheets, closing my eyes and letting the dreaming world take me away until I woke up after what felt like minutes later to a sound of scratching. My body froze as I heard the noise over and over again, softly coming from a closed door. I tried to relax myself, thinking that small noise I heard just a rat or some other animal that was spending the night in the closet while the cabin's owners were away. Quietly, I shifted into my back, pulling my half-wall mask down slightly so there's a little slit appeared, giving me a small window to look out. What was there? I laid on the bed, stiff as a board, with my cap and my mask covering my face, in such a way that it acted like a visor, giving me a small peek at what was in the darkness. Thankfully, my eyes were still adjusted to the dark, which gave me a small amount of reassurance. I continued looking into the direction of the scratching noise was coming from. The scratching continued louder and longer for what seemed like minutes until, just like that, it suddenly stopped. Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't a safe kind of silence. There was deafening silence in the room. There was a foreboding, ominous sort of silence. The vacuum of sound in the air was the type of silence that happens to, like in a movie, just before something jumps out at you. Just when I began to calm myself down, the doorknob of the closet began jiggling, and then turned very slowly. My heart was racing out of my chest. I saw and heard that knob turn, and every inch of my body wanted to bolt out of that bed, out of the cabin, before whatever it was on the other side of that door got out at me. But I laid perfectly still in that bed, despite the fact that I had a cocktail of adrenaline, nerves, and instincts telling me to get the hell out of there. My eyes widened as I saw the door in the closet open slightly. I saw what looked like a dried hand, attached to an elongated neck, popping from behind the darkness. Opening followed a skeletal body. The thing was emerging from the closet, crawled on all fours out of the doorway, and slowly made its way to the bed I was sleeping in. I'd never been more frightened in my whole entire life. As the thing stood up, almost touching the roof of the cabin, and looked in my direction. The creature stood there, studying me as I peeked through the slit in my mask in pure terror. Swirling around in my mind as I glanced up at the body, the creature looking. In the skeletal face, I noticed that it had no eyes in it, just empty eye sockets, which led me to believe that it couldn't see me, even though I could see it. Just when the idea of not being able to see me gave me a little more comfort, the creature began to speak. "Strange," the creature whispered softly as it continued to watch. Then it began to speak again. "It has no fear of me," the creature continued to say in a hoarse tone, as it began to breathe loudly, continuing to look at me, griping down on the edge of my bed. Feeling the creature's bony hand touch the edge of my bed caused my brain to go into complete panic mode. The only thing that stopped me from jumping up was a thought that maybe the creature believed I was dead or asleep and wouldn't attack. "How can it not fear? How can it not fear me?" the thing said, clenched its teeth before loudly gasping, pulling back its mouth in an open expression that seemed like fear. "It has no face," the thing whispered to itself, continued to back away. "It has no face," the creature said again, this time louder, before slightly more threatening. "It has no face," the creature shouted. It backed off further away from the bed. I heard the thing breathe loudly and quietly before calming down and slowly returning to the side of the bed. Leaning over me slowly, the creature continued to look at me before softly beginning to breathe on my face. I could smell its foul breath even through my mask. The smell was so powerful it took all my strength not to gag as a reflex to the awful stench in my mind. I made the choice to keep motionless and do not say anything that could compromise whatever illusion I was giving to the thing. that was currently studying me. The creature breathed over me again softly. The stench smelled from its breath could only be described as pure death, which has only strengthened my resolve to stay perfectly motionless. Strange, the thing whispered at me again, leaning in close. The point where I could see and smell its decaying flesh. The creature slowly reached for me, as its hand slowly moving towards my face with every inch of that decaying hand. I couldn't help but feel my situation becoming more and more dire. I thought that this was it for me. The creature would kill me tonight, or take me away and torture me and then kill me. And then no one would know what happened to me. No one would find my body out here. No one would know my story. I could feel tears start to swell up in my eyes as I thought of everyone that I ever loved being yanked away from me at the moment. No face. No face. No face, the creature repeated softly, and chanted as its hands crept ever closer to my face. I could hear the anguish in the creature's voice as it continued chanting over and over as it reached for me. The creature's long, bony hand crept only centimeters away from my face. I braced myself for the worst, making the last thoughts I would ever have about the people who I loved. Just as I thought my life was over, all of a sudden, a loud noise erupted from the room, filling my ear closest to the nightstand with a flood of beeps. It caused the creature to scream and jump back. As the noise continued, the creature threw itself back against the wall, shrieking uncontrollably in terror as it stumbled back towards the closet. I was dumbstruck for a second before the thought came that I had set my alarm for 4:30, which meant I had been the source of the noise. I jumped out of the bed, grabbed my phone, pointing it the lit-up scream at the monster as the alarm continued to ring loudly. The loud ringing caused the monster to shriek even more. Confusion and terror as it retreated quicker as I approached it. Seeing my chance, I activated my phone's flashlight and put it on strobe in order to disorient the monster further. No face! No face! No face! The creature shrieked at me as it withdrew to the safety of its closet. I continued to shine my light at the creature, and for added effect I started playing loud music as I continued to jab my phone at the monster's direction like a lion tamer. The thing threw itself into the dark recesses of the closet as I shoved the door back, locking it after I slammed it in the closet. The shrieks coming from the monster started to get fainter and fainter, like it was retreating deeper into the house. No face! No face! It has no face! I could hear the creature yell out as it got further and further away. After hearing its last entreating words, the words of the thing that terrified me, I bolted from the cabin at breakneck speed, jumping into my car and floored it off the gravel road. I was shaking all over as I drove. When I pulled my half-whole mask further down my exposed skin, it was as white as the snow that littered the ground. I was so frightened by the whole experience as soon as I pulled into the first town I saw. I parked my car and began to sob uncontrollably for a while. The experience that I had just been through would scar me for life. But as I wept in my car, I couldn't help but start laughing a little. Between my fits of crying, I got through this whole ordeal without so much as a scratch on me, well beside the mental scars. I was fine. I was alive. I didn't have to worry anymore. After I was finished with my whole episode of crying and laughing like an insane person, I entered the store, sniffing and wiping away the rest of my tears. As I continued into the store, the cashier looked up at me, traced my direction with his eyes before continuing with what he was doing. In the store was mostly empty, besides an elderly couple. I was the only customer in there. Had a rough night? The cashier said, with one eyebrow cocked with He scanned my items. "You have no idea," I said, looking out the window at the sunny winter day. "I noticed you looked a bit upset when you came in. What happened? You get dumped or something?" he said, looking at me from the register counter, at how much I owed him. Looking at the young man behind the register, he seemed a little younger than I was, although it doesn't say much. Even though I'm 22, I look a lot younger than my age. I looked at the cashier's name tag for a second before feeling I had nothing to lose by telling him about the night I had just had. The small name tag on his ID read Evan. As I finished telling him my frightened tale, something odd happened. I expected him to burst out laughing or say I was the best liar he'd ever talked to. Instead of doing anything that even, he just stood there, his skin milk white, as he stared at me with an expression of so horrified, he gave me the impression that he had just witnessed someone get run over by a train or something. "Evan, are you all right?" I said, looking him in the eyes. Both stood there quiet. "Well, what, yeah, I just," Evan began saying before his thoughts trailed off, due to the new feeling that we were both being watched. I began to feel eyes burn in the back of my head before turning around to see the old couple glance at. I entered the store beforehand. The old couple possessed the same horror look that Evan had just a few seconds ago. They must have heard the whole story I told. After a few moments of silence, the old couple asked what I knew about the cabin, to which I couldn't really say I'd given them the best description I could about what I saw. The couple proceeded to tell me about the cabin, how long it had been there, that it was haunted by a presence so terrifying that the place was condemned and left to rot away after so many people had disappeared there. They told me that no one who ever stayed the night in that cabin had ever been seen alive again, if they'd ever been seen at all after their visit. One of my best friends stayed in that cabin," Evan said quietly as he stared off into the distance, but continued with his thoughts. I refused to go in that cabin. I knew something bad would happen if I went. I tried to convince him that they were stupid not to go in, but he refused to be labeled a chicken and continued with the dare." Evan's eyes began to tear up as he continued with his story. "I never saw him again after that night. I kept calling his house, but his parents still couldn't find him. I put out flyers and billboards, but we never had any luck. After a few days, we contacted the police. I told them about the cabin." Evan began to choke down his tears, and he clenched his fist. "They found him in the basement of that cabin, sprawled out on the floor. His eyes were surgically removed from his eye sockets. His nose was removed, his lips, they were sliced off. When they found him, he was naked with an incision at the bottom of his rib cage, his pelvis down the middle of his body, and all of his internal organs were extracted from his body. And to add insult to injury, his genitals were sliced clean off. But you know what was the worst part of it all? When the police did an autopsy on the body, they found that he was alive through the whole process." Evan winced as he remembered the whole gruesome sight. They never found who or what did that. There was no DNA evidence, never convicted anyone. They found no tools that made the incisions, they didn't find anything. Evan clenched his fist tighter to the table before the old man, listening to the conversation, put his hand on Evan's shoulder, reassuring him that it was going to be all right. As he comforted Evan, he looked at me and said, "People have been disappearing from that area for decades, maybe even centuries, for all we know. But the bodies always end up in the same gruesome way. I don't care who you are. No one deserves something like that happening to them. They should just torch that evil place to the ground." The old lady joined her husband's side, looking at me with the most foreboding face I'd ever seen. If your story is true, you should consider yourself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. In all my years of living, you are the only one to go into that cabin and come out alive," the woman said, gripping into her husband's hand tightly as she spoke to me. After hearing the old woman's words, I realized that Evan said the body of his friend was found in the basement, which explains where the monster's voice got farther. Would have pulled me into that basement if my phone hadn't gone off. I quickly paid for my items and left the store, more troubled now than I was when I entered, feeling drowsy due to lack of sleep and constant adrenaline rush caused by my whole traumatic ordeal. I decided to go to a hotel and spend the day sleeping and relaxing to get my mind off things. That night, I sat in the bed of my hotel room, looked at the 2 items that had saved my life in one hand. I gripped my half-whole mask, which hid my face from that terrible thing. In my other hand was my cell phone, which scared that horrible beast that could have killed me. I decided from that day on I would always wear my half-whole mask in bed. It saved my life. That's the least I can do for it. In a recent brush with death I experienced taught me that life is too precious to waste. So I decided to ask my best friend Samantha out on a date. Things worked perfectly. Samantha and I were together for 2 years before I recently asked her hand in marriage, in which she said yes. Part of me will never forget that awful night. Because of it, I have only been wearing a half-whole mask to bed every night, since I've also made it a priority not to live in any type of house that has a basement. I also added safety measurements and started locking every door before going out to bed. It's a pain, but you can never be too careful. Despite these crazy precautions, Samantha has somehow accepted my little quirks and has continued to be supportive and continue to journey through life together. I couldn't be happier with the way things turned out in my life. I'm so lucky to be with Samantha and everything's perfect. There's just one thing that bothers me, and I think I might just have to blame it on my imagination, but sometimes when I wake up at night, it's really quiet. Sometimes I hear a soft scratching noise. Also, I think it's just paranoia, but I swear sometimes I hear the whisper, "No face," from inside my closet.